Well, what a magnificent place to visit. It was kind of like Old Home Week. I was with the Ways and Means Committee in Washington the entire time that Clinton was president. And the Ways and Means Committee engaged with the president on many occasions, most of them not overly pleasant. I worked for Republicans. I was telling Bob earlier, walking through the wonderful library, that Republicans, I know none of you would even suspect this, but Republicans didn't like Clinton. And if you think about what Clinton did, the main things, at least in my view, that he did as president, he passed welfare reform, which we'll talk about in detail. He passed NAFTA. I remember I was a part of a group with the leadership in the House, and the representatives from the White House said, the president is going to get you 50 Democratic votes. Can you get the rest? And everybody doubted he'd get 50 Democratic votes because Democrats are not necessarily free traders. He delivered, I think, 51 votes, and Republicans got the rest, and the bill passed. The great bill. It's had a tremendous impact on our economy and paid for itself many times over. And the third thing he did was balance the budget, which, as you can see, given our current condition, no one has been able to do since. In fact, both Republicans and Democrats enjoyed killing the budget surplus that Clinton created for us, and we're not even close to reaching balance and probably won't be again. And in my view, it's the nation's biggest problem. So those are the great things he did, and I'll reflect on those things for a minute. NAFTA, welfare reform, ending the budget deficit, and producing a budget surplus. Those are all major Republican issues. And yet Republicans didn't like them. What was their basis for not liking Clinton? Plus, he was colorful. So go figure. I think he was a near great president, and it was great to see the library and some of the events I remembered very well, and one or two of them I even participated in. So it was really a great experience to see the library, and what a gorgeous building. So as I say, I think one of Clinton's major achievements was welfare reform. And one of the most notable things about welfare reform, at least from Clinton's perspective, was that he defied his own party. The president's supposed to be the leader of a political party, and Clinton certainly was. And all three of the issues I mentioned to you, none of them are overly popular among Democrats. And yet Clinton achieved all of them. He was criticized by his party, but he led the party and got the votes from his party. There's a wonderful story about the final day of welfare reform legislation, and I'll tell you this right now. It's a little bit out of order, but I think it gives you an idea about what Clinton was like. So Republicans, he'd already vetoed the bill twice, so it had been through the House and the Senate, voted on, sent to the president, he vetoed it. Same thing again, he vetoed it. So now we're at the third time. It's in July of 1996, and we decided to bring the bill to the floor for the final passage. It had already been through the House and the Senate and worked out compromise, and now it's going to be voted on in the House and the Senate the same day. So it's about to go to the president. And the Democrats did not realize it was going to come up this quickly, so the president was supposed to play golf that day. So here's the president in his golf clothes, and he finds out the bill is coming to the floor that morning. So he calls up members of the cabinet and several people that he really respected in administration and meets with them in the Oval Office for like 3 hours. This is vintage Clinton. And he goes around the room, he makes every member of the cabinet that was there and the other people that he respected for their positions on welfare and other social issues tell him what he should do. Well, it turned out there were only two people in the room who thought he should sign the bill. They all recommend, including Donna Shalala and many others that you know, recommend that he not sign the bill. So then after 2.5 or 3 hours of this discussion, he went in the Oval Office with his main welfare reform guy. I got a person named Bruce Reed. They have several pictures of Bruce over in the library, and the vice president. And he goes through the whole thing again now, reasons to sign it, reasons not to sign it, and so forth, for about a half an hour. And finally, of course, Bruce Reed told him all along to sign the bill. And the vice president finally said that he would sign the bill. And Clinton said, I'm going to sign the bill. So he had to go run upstairs and change his clothes. He goes into the press room. Well, During this whole time, we are on the floor. Now, this will tell you something about Washington politics, because Democrats did not want to vote on the final bill until they knew what the president was going to do. And the reason is that if the bill is going to pass, and the bill is going to pass, but if he's going to sign it and it's going to become law, they want to have supported the bill. They only want to vote against it if he's going to veto it. And so here's Clinton going through all this stuff. Well, meanwhile, they've got a stall on the floor. So they pulled every parliamentary maneuver you could possibly imagine, some of which were just hilarious, the things that they did to delay the vote. So finally, the president decided he's going to sign the bill. And do you know, at that point, the most votes that we'd ever got, the bill had been through the House at least 6 or 7 times, and the most votes Republicans had ever gotten from Democrats on final passage was 18. Half the Democrats in the House voted for the bill when they found out the president was going to sign it. And half the Democrats in the Senate voted for the bill. So it was and virtually every Republican. So it was a highly bipartisan bill. The bipartisan vote was greater than the bipartisan vote for Medicare and Medicaid. I can show you how popular this issue was, despite the fact, as I'll show you in a few minutes, there was a long, ugly, ugly debate. But in the end, because of Clinton's leadership, it was a highly bipartisan bill, and of course, signed by a Democratic president. So it could truly be said that this fairly radical welfare reform bill really enjoyed bipartisan support. So I'm going to talk about the bill. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to just tell you what the bill was like and what was in the bill. I can't possibly do justice to it given the time we have, but I can tell you the main features of the bill, and then I want to tell you what happened after the bill began to be implemented. So let's assume this. There we go. All right, so first of all, the welfare reform bill, I'm only going to talk about the part that has to do with the old AFDC program. That's a cash welfare program, and it was completely replaced. It was repealed and replaced by something called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF. But there were many, many other major provisions in the bill. There were huge provisions on food stamps. There were provisions on supplemental security income, provisions on welfare for non-citizens. So there were many, many other provisions, all of which were controversial. This is like 6 or 7 very controversial bills all in one package. And we don't have time to talk about those other things, but if you want to ask questions about them during question and answer, I'd be happy to. So this is about the part of the bill that had to do with work. And this is the bill that Clinton had really focused on. Both when he was a governor, he had very strong work program here in Arkansas when he was governor, and as president. And he used it frequently during the campaign. He said he was a new Democrat. He's a different kind of Democrat because he believes people should work. He does not like welfare. He wants people to be self-sufficient. Well, Republicans had never heard a Democrat talk like that, and a lot of Republicans suspected that it was politics, that this is part of the way he's going to be elected president, and then he'll change completely when he gets to be president. But he tricked him and signed the bill, thank God. So here is what was controversial about the bill. The first thing is that the concept of entitlement means that you have a legal right to a benefit and nobody can take it away from you unless you in some way violate the law. So Social Security is an entitlement. Medicare is an entitlement. You have a legal right to the benefit. And in the old system, AFDC was a cash entitlement program for welfare. So you, just by virtue of the fact that you had a child, were entitled to a certain amount of money. And a lot of people didn't like that. Most of them are Republicans, so that was one thing. So explicitly, the bill ended the entitlement. That was extremely controversial. It's a New Deal program, and it was the first major New Deal program that had been completely repealed and the first entitlement been repealed. So that's very, very controversial, and for a Democratic president to sign it borders on amazing. It's block grant funding. This is a huge provision in the bill, very important. So what the federal government did was say to the states, under the old system, if you add people to welfare, you get more federal money because the federal government pays at least 50% of the benefit. And so if the state is successful in getting people off welfare, they are rewarded. Think about this, a policy students here. You're rewarded by getting your federal money cut. So the incentives don't make sense under the old system. And by contrast, if you add a lot of people to welfare, then the federal government rewards you by giving you more and more money. So under the new system, every state is going to get, roughly speaking, the amount of money it got in 1995. It's actually more complicated than that. And they're going to get that amount, and if they add people to rolls, they're going to have to absorb the cost themselves. That was one thing that Democrats didn't like at all. And if they get people off the rolls, they get to keep the change, so to speak. So this gives states high motivation to help people get off welfare because of the block grant structure. Third, one of the most controversial features was work requirements coupled with sanctions. And the sanctions, the federal statute said to the states, you have to have work requirements, and people who don't meet your work requirements must have their benefit reduced. The states got to fill in the blanks, so to speak, and make up the particular system they want. But nothing like this had ever been a characteristic of welfare. That if you don't meet a work requirement, your benefit is going to be reduced, and eventually you're going to lose the whole benefit. And then finally, maybe the most controversial feature of all was that you are only allowed to be on welfare for 5 years. At the time that this bill passed, ironically, based on research done by 2 professors at Harvard, Mary Jo Bain and David Elwood, who were a member of the Clinton administration at the time that the legislation passed, they did very sophisticated research to show that at any given moment, the average length of spells on welfare, if you count all repeat spells and project into the future, that was the hard part of the research, the average recipient at any given moment would be on welfare for 8 years or more. 8 years. And here, the limit is 5 years. So this is an extremely controversial, almost revolutionary feature of the bill, and yet Clinton accepted that as well. That was one of the most controversial parts. So those are the features of the bill. Now what happened? All right, here's what happened to the rolls. As you can see, the rolls virtually never declined in the past. There's a little decline here and kind of a stable here, but mostly just went up and up and up. And when we passed the Welfare Reform Bill, it was in the midst, really, except for this period right here back in the 60s, in the biggest increase in the rolls ever. And now look what happens. The rolls decline precipitously. Now, it's important for me to say here, with some sense of fairness, that some people think the rolls declined too much, that people were either had been on for 5 years, or they didn't meet the state work requirement, and people were thrown off the rolls willy-nilly, and the state saved money that way. So that's a controversial feature of the bill. But the huge decline in welfare that had never happened before. All right. These are the work rates for single mothers and for never married mothers. So all the way from 1980 all the way to 2013. This is the period in question here because this is the welfare reform era. And as you can see, for all single mothers, and even more for never married single mothers, this is the most disadvantaged group, the least educated, the least work experience, the most likely to be in poverty, and yet their work rates increased very substantially. This is a 40% increase over 4 years in the percentage of never married mothers who worked. That is an amazing result. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics records for any demographic group in the last 100 years, there's never been an increase like this. So that was a huge increase in work by never married mothers. Now let's look at poverty. This is an extremely important outcome. And let's look at poverty for all children, for black children, and for female-headed families. Let me tell you first, the poverty rate among kids in female-headed families is 5 times as great as the poverty rate among kids in married couple families. So think about this. If we're going to have an effective national strategy to reduce poverty among children, we have to focus a lot of attention on single-parent families because they are most likely to have kids in poverty. And so you can see here that remember the work is going up like this, and look what happens to poverty. Both among all kids in single-parent families and among black children, who are the most vulnerable because they're the most likely to be in female-headed families. These are, starting in 1999, these are the lowest rates of poverty for kids in female-headed families and black children ever. So not only did the work rate increase, but poverty declined very substantially, and I'm including married couple families just so you can get a point of reference here. Not much going on down here, but these big declines exactly at the time that the moms begin to work more. All right, now, I want to tell you about, it might be hard to, here we go. You fixed it. How about that? We could not get, it's a long story, but this is fixed, so that's what threw me off for a minute. All right. Now, I want to tell you the liberal part of this story, and Clinton played a big role in this too. It wasn't just the tough requirements of welfare reform that accounted for these big increases in work and especially the declines in poverty. Because over a period of maybe as much as 15 years before welfare reform passed, the Congress passed many pieces of legislation that were specifically intended to give benefits to supplement wages, so to speak, to give benefits to people who had the courage to leave welfare so they wouldn't be dependent on public benefits, that they could make it on their own. Well, we know that they're going to work for then $6, $7, $8 an hour, and now $8 or $9 an hour. There are millions of Americans that work for that, and they have children. So doesn't it make sense not to give them only welfare at the time that they're not working at all, but to create a system that if they go to work, then we'll supplement their wages? So we created a whole series of policies, but especially the Earned Income Tax Credit, which can give a family with 3 children as much as $6,000 a year through the tax code if they're a low-wage worker with children. So that's a huge incentive for them to leave welfare and go to work. We have another credit in the tax code called the Additional Child Tax Credit, which also could give families up to $2,000 if they have 2 children. We made a bunch of changes in the food stamp program to make it more friendly toward working families so that they could collect food stamps. And very importantly, there were a whole series of changes in the Medicaid program so that the link between welfare and Medicaid was completely severed. In the old days, before welfare reform, the only way that you could get Medicaid for your children was to be either on the AFDC program, that cash welfare program, or another program called Supplemental Security Income. So if you got off those programs because you got ambitious and tried to work, your child could lose his Medicaid coverage. Well, that's not a good way to do things either. So the link was completely severed, and within a couple of years after Clinton again made a major contribution and passed the state child health insurance program, the so-called CHIP or S-CHIP program, every child under 200% of poverty was covered regardless of the welfare status. So we completely severed the link. That was a very, very important thing. And Republicans wanted to make some big changes in Medicaid, and the president made it very clear he would never sign the bill if we made those changes in Medicaid, which would have had the effect of reducing the benefit. So that work support system, here is life in the state of nature, so to speak. These are all single moms in the United States, and as you can see, their poverty rates are very high. Oops. I need a lesson in operating this equipment. So this is the poverty rate without any public benefits, life in the state of nature, just based on earnings. And the poverty rate among single-parent families, now think of this, we have millions of children in single-parent families. The poverty rate is almost 50%. So now let's take into account those benefits that I mentioned to you, and here's what happens. When we include the cash welfare benefits and SSI, unemployment insurance, any form of cash from the federal government, the poverty rate drops down to 38%. This is the official poverty rate. When you see a poverty rate in the paper, that's the one that they're talking about, okay? Now, if we include the benefit from food stamps, poverty rate falls another 4 percentage points. If we include the poverty rate from those tax benefits, primarily the Earned Income Tax Credit, but a few as well, the poverty rate falls to 29%, and if you include the household of the income of other members in the family household, it falls to 24%. So we cut poverty by half if mothers work. So this is the system we created. It isn't just the strong work requirements to get moms to work, single moms to work. It's also to supplement their earnings. So it's a nice compromise of what the left wants and what the right wants, and it works very well. It cuts the poverty rate from 48% to 24%, which is by half. And it's a very effective system, and we're still improving it. I would expect that there'll be further improvements in this system and that poverty will be reduced further in the future. All right, now I want to talk about the past. So that's what happened. Now let's talk a little bit. I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes and then we'll have questions. So start thinking up your questions about how the welfare reform bill passed. I've already spoken to you about how conservative certainly, but how controversial it was. And the Congress, both the House and Senate, were completely divided like they are now. It would have been impossible to sign a bill without presidential leadership, I'm pretty sure. So what are the factors that contributed? The first one was that, as many of you may remember, it looks like most members of this audience, not this table over here, but the other tables looked to me like people were alive and in middle age at the time that this happened. This is the election of 1994, revolutionary event. Republicans took over the House for the first time in 40 years. And Republicans had been working for several years on welfare reform, so the members knew a lot about it. They had drafted various pieces of legislation. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. And they also took over the Senate. So situation just like it is now. Republicans control the House and the Senate. Democrats control the presidency. The difference is that Obama is not nearly as cooperative with Republicans as Clinton was, despite the fact that Republicans were extremely nasty to Clinton. So that's a big factor. The Republicans had just taken over the House. They were hell-bent to pass welfare reform, and as I've already told you, they passed it 3 times. They were so serious about it. Second thing, Republicans ran on something called the Contract with America. I don't know if any of you remember this, but it had 10 items that had been poll tested, and they were all popular American public, and I don't think the specific items, one of which, by the way, was welfare reform, and I don't think it was so much those particular issues that made a difference. What made a difference was the Republicans said to the American public, if you elect us, we are going to do these 10 things. They're making a commitment. All of them have to do with personal responsibility, getting the government off people's backs and so forth. And in the House, all 10 of these were actually brought to the floor. 8 of them passed, and that was the Contract with America, and one of them was the welfare reform legislation. So we started with real attention to welfare reform and passed the first welfare reform bill within the first 45 days of the 104th Congress in 1995, in less than 6 months after the election. So Contract with America. Third, as I've already suggested, Clinton wanted reform. He ran for president on it. He was a big welfare reform governor. He was the head of the Governors Association and led a legislation in 1988 in the federal government that was welfare reform legislation. It's quite different than the bill we're talking about here, but Clinton was a great leader in that as well. So Clinton had a long track record of being committed to welfare reform and to work. He talked specifically about work in many of his presidential campaigns, and he won a number of counties in the United States because he went there and gave talks about the importance of work and helping people get off welfare and get a job. Self-sufficiency was really crucial. And Democrats had hardly ever talked like that before, so that was a very important thing. Another factor, this is a good example of how political situations change. As all of you know, women started working after World War II a lot. And they gradually entered the labor force, and then starting in the 60s, it went up and up and up. I showed you a chart like that a few minutes ago. So if you have most mothers in the United States, including mothers with kids under age 1, who are now in the labor force, and they're paying taxes so other mothers can stay home with their kids, that doesn't work. It was much more popular to say that these low-income mothers that have children should be required to work than it would have been 10 or 20 or 30 years earlier, because it just did not make sense to have one group of mothers working and paying taxes so that other mothers could stay home and draw welfare benefits. That was not a sustainable system. So that was a big background factor. Another factor was a very hot economy. The economy of the 60s, it'd be great if we could have an economy like that today. Unemployment was low, and here's a feature that we haven't had virtually since 2000, and that is that wages at the bottom were actually going up. Now, wages at the bottom have been stable for more or less for 20 years, and wages have not increased at all, but during the second part of the 1990s, wages went up very nicely. So it was good timing to pass welfare reform at a time when unemployment was extremely low and when wages were increasing, because it made sense to require moms to work under those circumstances. I already mentioned the work support programs, earned income tax credit, food stamps, and so forth that were expanded to give supplements, income supplements, and most of the mothers, in fact, I would say easily 95% of the mothers who went to work had much more money than they had when they were on welfare. And they said that in interviews. If you interviewed them, they not only were proud of themselves for working, but they had more money, and they talked about they could do more for their kids and so forth. So the work support programs were a big part of it. Another part that's really important, and Clinton played a huge role in this as well, and that is the states wanted welfare reform, including the states with Democratic governors. You often see this, that Democrats and Republicans both, who are governors, are very different than the Republicans, than their brethren in their party in Washington. You see this now with Medicaid and with Obamacare. Republican governors, they would like to take Medicaid, that's a part of Obamacare, and they would like to support Obamacare, and some of them actually do, whereas in Washington, if you support Obamacare, you're going to be drummed out of the Republican Party. Your life would be in danger. Someone's going to put sugar in your gas tank, probably the Speaker. So, I mean, this thing, it's not unusual for this to happen. So the governors, both Democrat and Republican, are doing demonstrations. They got waivers from the AFDC program that I talked that we eventually repealed so that they could break the law legally and have the kind of requirements that I showed you in that first chart. They could have time limits, they could have work requirements, they could have sanctions, and they were doing it. So the governors were very supportive of this legislation, especially Republican governors. I've been in Washington now 30 years. I have never seen any issue even close to having governors who played such a crucial role. Democratic governors somewhat, but especially Republican governors. Engler from Michigan, Thompson from Wisconsin, and several others constantly were there testifying. They helped write the legislation. They helped with the publicity of the legislation. So it was a lot of governors' involvement. And think of this, 40 states had waivers that I'm describing here, and were doing demonstrations. So they were already doing, think of this, now this is a good lesson about doing policy, because they were already doing the kind of things that they were going to be required to do under federal legislation. So not only did they support it, they were voting with their feet, but they also had experience doing it. They had trained staff, usually not for the whole state, but they were on the road, and they had training, they had a philosophy of what they were trying to do. Many of them had statutes or regulations in their own government. So the country was moving in the direction that the welfare reform bill took them a few more steps down the road. Often federal legislation contradicts what the population wants to do and what the states want to do, but that was not the case here. And then finally, strong, amazing leadership from both Gingrich and Clinton. I mentioned that the bill had been vetoed twice. Here's an example of the kind of leadership that Gingrich was able to give. Unfortunately, it fell apart after about 4 years, and he was much less effective, and now a lot of people think he's, a little bit nuts. But some people thought that then, too. He had very mixed media coverage, to put it mildly. So Republicans closed the government twice. This is not a good thing to do. This results in unpopularity. Republicans tried it again last year and then got whacked for doing it that time, too. And there's still a lot of Republicans who would like to close the government again. So Republicans closed the government, and the second time, the big issue is welfare reform is part of it, but the bigger issue is the budget. And Republicans wanted to cut all kinds of programs, and including Medicaid that I told you about. They also wanted to cut taxes at the same time on the wealthy. This is a typical Republican agenda. And a lot of people thought, in fact, you know what, I think this was a turning point in the Clinton presidency, because a lot of people thought he was going to cave. Well, he didn't cave. And that's a main reason he vetoed those bills. So now, imagine, after 2 vetoes, Republicans send a big budget and welfare reform back up to the president again, and it's being negotiated. The government's closed. People are going nuts about Republican cruelty, and, it's not the way to run a government and so forth. So Gingrich is in negotiation with the White House. He comes back. We're in a big, magnificent room in the Cannon House office building, and he summarizes the deal for Republicans, okay? Here's the deal, and he goes right down the provisions, almost without notes. It was quite an impressive performance. And he gets done. And he says to the room full of Republicans, half of whom are, you know, they're never gonna compromise. Compromise is horrible and so forth. And Gingrich says, now, this is not the best bill, but this is the best bill we can get. And if you don't support it, you can get yourself another speaker. And Republicans supported it. A lot of them didn't want to, but they did support it. And we passed it, and the government was opened the very next day. So that's an example of the kind of leadership, and I give you several examples about Clinton. These are both men who were willing to defy their party and defy, you know, for good government and for what they believed in, and especially in Gingrich's case, for getting the government open again and stop this ridiculousness. So these are the factors that contributed to it. And I would just, as kind of stimulate your thought a little bit, a lot of these factors are not present now. And this is why we have such a difficult time in Washington passing legislation that has good support. I told you that the welfare reform bill eventually had huge support from Democrats and Republicans, and so did the budget measures that eventually, I can't remember if I mentioned this to you, but it balanced the budget. Yeah, I mentioned this to you. And these actions that Clinton took, in many ways against the interest of his own party. So, there's a very famous Churchill quote that says, democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others. And it's true. Welfare reform is an example of it. It was an ugly debate, very nasty things said on the floor, both the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats yelling at each other literally on the floor while they're doing the public's business. And yet in the end, came together and passed a bill that had some good effects, I think generally good effects. There's still some problems, but generally good effects. And great leadership from both the Democratic president and a Republican Speaker of the House, and I haven't mentioned Dole, but Dole was the majority leader in the Senate, and he did a fine job too. That's what we need again. If we got it again, we could pass equally interesting legislation that would have a beneficial effect on the future of the country. So thank you. I welcome any questions you might have.
Thank you, Your Honor. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Right behind you, Bob. Oh.
You have to ask questions, because otherwise I'm going to ask questions of myself, and I know all the answers to the questions I ask myself. So try to stump the speaker.
Hi, I'm Anna Strong, and I'm a Clinton School alum from class of 2011, so it's been a while, but I was really excited to hear you talk tonight. I am curious about, I really loved your chart where you talked about the different pieces that, you know, added to reducing or cutting the poverty level in half. I wondered if you had any comments on either historical or on the current discussion around universal child care and paid maternity leave and how they could potentially contribute to changes in that chart as well. Okay,
I might forget maternity leave, so wave your arms. I'm going to talk about preschool programs and child care. This is something I'm extremely interested in. I do think that if we had high quality preschool programs, we could reduce welfare in the future because it could make a big difference. The problem is that our preschool programs are of mediocre or worse quality on the whole. Now, some of them are great. You know, probably many of you have heard of the bell curve. Most things in life are normally distributed, which means you have a few really good ones and a few really lousy ones, but most of them are in the middle. They're kind of okay. And that's the way daycare is in the United States. We have a few wonderful facilities, and I'll bet the same thing's true right here in Little Rock. If you did a survey of every daycare facility here, including Head Start, so and state pre-K, which you have also in Arkansas, you would find that there's some really good programs and there's some really horrible, even dangerous programs, but most of them are mediocre. And we now know from many years of research that mediocre programs do not produce the impacts on development that we need. The justification to spend, let's say, $9,000 or $10,000 a year, which is what we spend on Head Start, and we probably would need to spend even more if we had really high quality programs. If you don't have that quality, you're not going to produce the effects on the kids' development. and you're not going to get the long-term benefits. So people are running around giving about all these great benefits, $7 return for every dollar invested in preschool. That would not apply to the huge majority of daycare facilities in the United States. Now, next point. There's a real conflict here. Imagine you're a governor of a state, and we have a thing called the Child Care and Development Block Grant, and we expanded it in the welfare reform legislation. We put more money in it, and we gave the states money, plus they have Head Start money, plus many states have their own money that they spend, and they spend even more now. So I want to have a strong work program, and I want more and more single moms. Married moms could work too, but they don't have high poverty rates. So, and I want them to work. Well, if I send them to mediocre daycare, it probably costs $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 a year. But if I send them to high quality, it costs 10. So I could serve twice as many mothers if I send them to moderate facilities. And guess what? If I let the mothers decide, many of them are going to pick moderate facilities. Some of them are going to send the kid to grandma or to some neighborhood provider that is not trained and not high quality and so forth. So that's what many states do. They send the kids to daycare that's not very good. And still, with all the federal dollars we're spending, I think roughly $25 billion or so a year, if you include the home visiting programs and early Head Start, $25 billion a year, only about 20% of the moms who are eligible for a daycare subsidy get anything. So, in my opinion, this would be right at the top of my list of things we need. We need better preschool programs. It's going to take at least a decade to develop, even to have a major impact, because we got to train more teachers and so forth and so on. So this is a great question. The answer is we're doing a mediocre job, and many of the mothers can't even get a subsidy for mediocre care, let alone high quality care. So this is a big public problem. The president, by the way, has tried to address it. He introduced legislation that he would like to spend $80 billion over 10 years improving preschool programs. It includes home visiting. And the bill, it hadn't gotten 2 seconds worth of attention. The Democrats have not pushed it, even when they controlled the House and the Senate back in the beginning of the Obama administration. So the prospects for anything serious at the federal level are zilch. It's not going to happen in my lifetime, which is a lot less than your lifetime. I don't think it's going to help. I don't think it's going to happen in God's lifetime. So if we're going to have high quality preschool programs, it's going to have to come from the states. Oh, yeah. You know, I think the prospects for imposing requirements on employers are dim. We have one piece of legislation, Clinton, that happened during Clinton's presidency. He was a strong supporter of maternal leave at the time of birth. And we should have something like that. We need to have more support for families with children. But we have to figure out a way to do it that does not impose costs on employers. Because if you, first of all, it would be very, very difficult to pass anything that imposes new requirements on employers. And a lot of Democrats would not support it either, but Republicans' support would be virtually zero. So we've got to figure out other ways. Again, the states come into play here. The states are important. Voluntary efforts on the part of employers, but we do need better policy on moms having sick time off, both for themselves and for their children, and for maternity leave for mothers and fathers, whichever one wants to take it. So again, it's an area that we need to do more, as same with preschool, but the prospects I would call bleak, and that's being generous.
Sir, do you have one right here? Sorry, we'll come to you next.
Dennis Whiteman, I'm a University of Florida graduate in 1966 as opposed to 2011. I'm not familiar completely with the block grants, but you mentioned that states are able to reap free cash, so to speak, to either apply to similar requirements or other requirements. Are there states that do better than that, better than others with the welfare reform program?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, definitely. In fact, it's a good place, this is a good thing to talk about here in Arkansas. The way the block grant was formed is outrageously unfair. Outrageously. You know why? Because the way the block grant was formed, was however much a state had been spending, remember I said this before, however much that state had been spending, roughly speaking, in 1995, it was actually a little bit more complicated than that. Well, in the South, throughout the South, especially Arkansas and Mississippi, welfare benefits were really, really low. So under any kind of way that you would distribute a federal grant to the states, by population, by poverty population, no matter how you did it, it would be way fairer than the way we did it because it was based on what you were spending at the time. And the South had very low benefits. So California, on a per capita basis, gets way more than any of the southern states. At that time, it was the richest state in the Union. New York got way more. You know, all the wealthy states got way more on a per capita basis. Well, that is a lousy way to do policy. Equity is a crucial, remember this is a crucial theme of public policy, and it should be, both for individuals, for states, racial groups, and so forth. And it was violated. So the answer to your question is, block grants have a lot of flaws. Another flaw is that we tried to do this, but didn't try hard enough to build in an inflation adjustment. So the block grant loses approximately 3% of its value every year, and eventually it's going to be worth very little. So that's another flaw in the block grant. There are flaws in this legislation. I hope I've been frank about that. I think it's great legislation, and overall the effects have been good, but they're diminishing.
Right here.
My name is Mary Ann Taft, and I'm a retired public health nurse. One of the other things that's very difficult for single mothers trying to work is lack of transportation. And a city like Little Rock has some public transportation, but not nearly enough. And the outlying areas of central Arkansas have no public transportation. And unless you find somebody that's working where you got a job, you're stuck there too. So
Right.
It's not, why don't they get a job? There's lots of reasons.
Right.
Daycare, certainly, but, and then with daycare, they get vouchers, and there's some daycares that won't take the vouchers, or they take a limited number of them. So there's a lot of obstacles put in mom's way.
Right. Well, this is one of the reasons I think that we have a federalist form of government where states and localities have a lot of control. So a lot of the problems that you've mentioned here, and I think in the long run the solutions, are a state issue and not a federal issue. Federal issues, I think, in general are inferior because they just can't be sensitive enough to account for the differences between the states. And where we did it, as in the case of the block grant, it's perfectly incorrect. We gave way more money per capita to California and New York, rich states, than to Arkansas and Mississippi, very poor states. So I think it's good for the states to have initiative here. Now, we would never accept as an excuse from our child that they are not going to work because their car broke down or any of the reasons that you mentioned. You're going to say, it's your obligation as a citizen to work, to be self-sufficient. So you have to figure this out. Government should help. Government helped a lot more as a result of welfare reform because of the cash and so forth. So you have to rely on people to figure out these issues themselves. Now, I can tell you one interesting thing that happened after welfare reform, I wish we had more of this, where there were a number of places in the country where they got cars, older cars, from people who could afford to give their cars away, and they made them available. A lot of low-income people got cars virtually free because of small, usually state or even more often local programs that were focused on the very issue. So someone like you that was concerned about this started a program and raised money from wealthy people or from the United Way or whatever and tried to address these problems. That's a much more effective way to do it than the federal government, except that the federal government has a lot more money. And if the federal government comes in, they probably could spend more money and therefore more people could be helped, but there'd be lots of rules and regulations and so forth. So we need better solutions.
I think we were playing question tag. So my question was, since a child growing up in poverty is about 3 to 4 times more likely to live in poverty as an adult, and you talk about single moms, and single moms are one of the largest subpopulations who are in poverty. And then, one of the big requirements was that one, they could only stay on welfare for 5 years, and then two, they had to go to work. I wonder, are there any federal studies, or even state studies for that matter, on the effects of going to work and then that 5-year time limit on the kids in terms of education for the children, education achievements, and then also juvenile crime?
There are not studies that I'm aware of that look specifically at the 5-year time limit. I can tell you this, the 5-year time limit has not really affected very many people because they don't stay on 5 years anymore. Moms tend to leave before that. Many of them for work, but some of them, we know at the time of welfare reform, there were several surveys, about 60% of the, I showed you that line and a lot of people left, about 60% of them had employment. So 40% didn't. And exactly what happened to them, we have some studies, and it's not a nice story. We don't have enough studies, we don't know enough details. Some states have tried to help those mothers, they've been largely a failure. In my opinion, this is the biggest failure of welfare reform, is that we have this group of moms at the bottom who just cannot manage both to raise their kids and to hold down a job. And the pattern is usually they get a job, but they lose it pretty quickly, sometimes because of transportation, sometimes child care, sometimes a child's illness, and so forth. So that is definitely a problem. We do know that generally moms who went to work are better off. We have had many studies of the effects on their children, and here's roughly speaking what the studies show. For young children, if anything, they might be a little better off, especially if you measure their development, and especially their intellectual development. And that's probably because they're in child care, and some of them are in good child care. Most of them are in moderate child care, but that was more helpful to their development than living at home continuously and in the neighborhoods that they lived in. So if you study them at age 5, for example, they're a little better off. It's not a huge effect, but it wasn't damaging to the children. Except under age 1. There is a lot of evidence that both for middle-class kids and low-income kids, that under age 1, if the mom is gone a lot and the child is in daycare, non-maternal care, that does have a negative impact on the kid's development. For school-age kids, normally no effects. For adolescents, there are a couple studies that show negative effects, and especially among adolescents who had younger siblings. And the implication is that they were required or asked or for whatever by their parents, normally their single mom, to take care of the kids in the afternoon. So it changed their life, and they had responsibilities. Some people might think, well, that might be good. That could aid their development. But the research shows that it did not aid their development. So on the whole, there have not been big effects on the kids. We don't have good studies. We have good studies that show that a kid that comes from a family where the parents work and the family is self-sufficient, even if they're low income, that those kids tend to do better. They're more likely to be self-sufficient as adults and so forth. But if you start with a group of welfare mothers, and some of them go to work, the impact on the kids is neutral. We don't know enough about what happened to their kids when they grew up and they're 20, 30, 40 years old.
Ronald, thank you so much for visiting the Clinton School. Thank all of you for coming out. Please come up and ask him more questions and try to stump the speaker. And we'll hope to see you at the next one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.